So how about it? Let's do another Transformer Slag podcast Patreon listener question. Once again, if you want to be part of the Transformer Slag podcast Patreon, help support the podcast. Let us know we're doing a half decent job here in the Transformer world, giving you the news, information, facts, and educational videos. Patreon.com/Protoman. What does it get you if you join the podcast Patreon? Well, it gets you your name in the end credit scroll at the end of every segment, access to the Transformers Slag Discord, where we hang out, talk about the news, break the news, share lore, share sales, save money on your hobby, and then some. Love my Patreon. And of course, depending on what tier you are in the Patreon, you might get a little gift in the mail, Patreon listener question access, and more. So we got a Patreon listener question from patron Guido, and Guido wants to know, hey Proto, I first entered the collecting scene around the time of Transformers Combiner Wars, and at that time, I saw major criticism of the line when I was entering it, composed of how there was too many repainted characters. Even now, when opinion is brought up about the line today, a lot of people cite how the repaints were the biggest flaw. Now that we're in a post-War for Cybertron era, we have three entire lines that are devoted just to repaints of mainline molds, and people can't seem to get enough of them. Since you've been collecting in the collecting circle for such a long time, what has been your experience with the fandom's reaction to repaints? Were they always hated and were only recently coming around to loving them, or even demanding more? Or has there always been a vocal minority complaining about them? Thank you for your insight, Guido. Well, thank you for the Patreon listener question. Repaints fall into multiple different categories when it comes to the business side of it and the social demand of it. I've always had it broken down into 5 separate categories, and this comes from a creative standpoint. It's never really been discussed in the fandom. This is more on the creative side of thing, whether it be Hasbro official creativity or even that of like when you're thinking up an exclusive for a convention or something third party. The 5 categories are historical repaints, new character repaints, shoehorn repaints, homage repaints, and shallow repaints. And I'm going to explain what those 5 are in a moment. But just to kind of go into what people thought of them, it really depended on where they fell into those 5 categories, whether they knew it or not, because some are in more demand than others depending on where they fall into that. I know that, in the early days of Generation 1, no one was complaining about repaints because a lot of product was new molds. And that might have been at Hasbro's detriment because making new molds and tooling and everything like that is way more expensive than repainting something that's never been done before. Think of the majority lion's share of 1986, 1987 product moving forward to the end of Generation 1 that never even saw one repaint unless it was like a regional change or something. Like, oh, we're going to take this character, change it a little bit, and put it in Japan. Like, let's say a Minerva to a Nightbeat. But in general, you would never see like repaints of the same character within the same region. It was very rare. It would always be like, oh, here's this version's in Europe. And it could have helped Hasbro out a lot if they probably would have made a lot more use of it, but it was a different time. It was the downfall of G1, so it was a different story. And it's the same thing when we even go into Beast Wars. Initially, repaints didn't happen unless it really was a new character that garnered that repaint. But as time progressed, when Beast Wars went into its second half, look at the Fox Kids repaint subline and stuff like that. It was just a smart way to get some mileage out of those molds. So there was a more financial side of it too that existed. But with the fans, which is the real question you're asking here, it really has to do with how each one of those repaints are handled. So I'm going to go through these 5, and it'll kind of give you an idea, and then I'll give you an explanation of what really goes on. So the first one I mentioned, historical repaints. Now, historical repaints are like characters that historically have shared molds with other characters, and thus the repaint is expected by the fans. Another form of like a historical repaint, which kind of falls into category 2, which is new character repaints, is when you have like a new character that's repainted from that certain paint scheme, and then that kind of becomes associated with that character from that point on. A good example being like, let's say, Cybertron Red Alert, and then we have a repaint of him into Cannonball, a new character, And then from that point on, if we get a Cybertron Red Alert, there's going to be an expectation. Oh, well, if we do Cannonball, it'd be cool. So there's that expectation of those two. So that's kind of the historical repaint. That falls, again, into new category territory, because new character territory, because it's created by that and then becomes historical repaint. But not all new character repaints are as successful, and I'll get into that in a moment. But of course, also what falls into historical repaints is stuff that's repainted into colors that are historically linked with that character, but don't have a character yet. And that's stuff like, let's say, Sunstreaker into Spin Out and all those other Diaclone and Microman color schemes, or even characters that didn't have a name yet, but they've made cameos in the background, like, let's say, Sunstorm. Let's take a Seeker Jet, turn it that yellowish, orangey kind of color scheme, and now it's Sunstorm, and forever on, now we have expectations of Seeker Jets to have that color scheme. Historical repaints are extremely popular with fans because, again, it throws back to those historical characters, and that's what we've been seeing a lot of recently with Transformers, so they're not as hated because it's probably the category of repaints that people want the most. They want historical repaints. Let's get into the second category. Like I mentioned, new character repaints. New character repaints are pretty much taking a mold and creating a brand new character from them. These characters didn't exist in fiction. They didn't exist in comic books previously. They're a brand new character created from that mold. It's not so much something like, let's say, oh, well, you had Inferno and then you get Grapple. It's chicken before the egg with a lot of those, because that's also a retool. But there's something that's more like taking Laser Rod Optimus Prime and then turning it into Black Convoy / Scourge. Such a distance and a gap between those, and creating a brand new character out of a previously existing mold. An Optimus Prime mold into an evil Optimus Prime character. But when we're talking new characters, there could also be like a slew of brand new characters that just see never any kind of fiction, really. Transformers Cybertron is a good example, or the early movie line stuff, where you'd get tons of repaints of previously existing characters into brand new characters that never really had any fiction. I mentioned Cannonball from Red Alert, but there's Repugnus from Undermine. Undermine was a character in Cybertron, but the Repugnus repaint was not so much the case. And the early movie line stuff just had tons of them. I mean, I don't even know where to begin with that. There is tons of new, they were just made just to have a brand new color scheme on that Sideswipe mold or that Bumblebee mold or whatever, just to make a new character, just to sell yet again another toy. And this second category, the fans are kind of divided on. Sometimes you get really cool characters out of it that become iconic forever, like a Scourge, even like Cannonball has his fans. But then you have, like I said, the slew of ones that are just kind of forgettable in a lot of ways. Like even the one that was named Repugnus, it wasn't exactly iconic, even though it was based off of that old G1 character. And that Repugnus one falls into the homage repaints too, which is a whole other story we'll get into in a moment. Then we have the shoehorn repaints. Shoehorn repaints are, and it sounds negative, but it really is, you'll understand what I mean. The shoehorn repaints are repaints that take molds that pretty much turn them into iconic characters. The mold wasn't originally that iconic character, they turn it into that. Best example of that was what Bakan was doing for the longest time in 2001 going forward. They started with that with like Bakan 2001's Tigatron and RC using Transmetal 2 Black Arachnia and at the time the Ravage mold, Beast Wars Ravage mold, Ravage X9, and turning them into iconic characters. Thus, the selling point of these molds, even though they're repaints, is they're based on iconic characters, and you want to get it based on that. Like you mentioned in your question, a majority of Combiner Wars was repainting those molds, not into brand new characters, but iconic characters instead. Taking Motormaster, turning into Optimus Prime. Taking some of those Stunticon molds and turning them into some of those iconic Autobot G1 car characters. Turning X character, repainting it, putting a brand new head sculpt, and selling it and have it sell and riding on the fact that it's based on that known character. So those ones are the slighter, weaker ones with fans. But again, because they're based on known characters, sometimes fans will overlook all those repaints and go, you know what, it's not too bad because it's based off of a character I like. But they're also probably some of the weaker repaints that we have. Then we have the homage repaints. These were something that really started up in Beast Machines, where they're like, well, let's take a mold and let's paint it in an iconic color scheme that's based off of an iconic character, but we're not going to call it that character. Beast Machines Primal Prime, giving him those G1 colors on an Optimal Optimus mold, but it's not Optimus Prime. Robots in Disguise 2001 Jetstorm, giving him those G1 Jetfire colors, but it's not G1 Jetfire. And I could go on and on. Best example being Super Speedbreaker, aka Super Sideburn from Robots in Disguise 2001, as Hot Rod, or Armada Hotshot as Hot Rod, or Cybertron Excellion as Hot Rod. You know, like coloring him as Hot Rod, but not being Hot Rod in any of those iterations. Those ones find somewhat interest from fans, but in general, nowadays, we don't really see that. Now, if you're going to give someone a color scheme that's homaging that character, they rather just make it that named character. But back then, they didn't really have the trademarks for a lot of... I'm pretty sure, like, Speedbreaker, Sideburn, Armada Hotshot, if they could have had Hot Rod, they probably would have called him that. But that's usually... You don't really see the homage repaints anymore outside of probably the best example, like GoBot homages or something like that. You might get, like, the odd GoBot character, and they just, because they don't have the trademark to that character. But in general, we'll usually see, if they're going to do that color scheme, they'll call it Wheeljack. They won't just give it the Wheeljack color scheme and call it Downshift. It's a whole other different story. And those ones, we don't really see them that much anymore, because now Hasbro makes a concentrated effort. If they're going to put something out, the IP is better to share those colors with those characters. And then the last one, and the least popular of the bunch, and it's probably the one that was the most hated by people, is the shallow repaints. These were the ones that people really hated. The Tuner Mudflaps, the Stealth Bumblebees, the Blue Steel Sideswipes, repaints with no fictional context, just to repaint another toy, just to put it out there. And a lot of these were found in those early movie lines. They needed to have more product out there. The movie line stuff was selling like crazy. And why not just take every mold and repaint it 5 times into 5 different color schemes that didn't really serve a purpose? Not a new character, not an homage, not a historical repaint, just it's Bumblebee, but now with slightly more battle damage, and now it's called Final Battle Bumblebee. It's Sideswipe, but he has a blue color scheme, and now it's called Blue Steel Sideswipe. And, Hasbro really did a lot of these, but then they stopped doing them in large numbers when sales started to slide. And then, of course, the legend of Tuner Mudflap. Everyone knows the story of Tuner Mudflap and how there was tons of those out there. It was just littering the walls. You couldn't do those shallow repaints. And then, of course, there was the Hive, the Sea of Bumblebees, because there was just so many of the same Bumblebee repaints, and no one wanted them because there was just too many. Today, we don't really see the shallow repaint anymore. We get the odd black repaint of like a Stealth Bumblebee or a Night Attack Bumblebee from Cyberverse, but it's really not that common anymore. And to go to your question, why is it not, again, why don't we hear the complaints as much anymore? Because now, out of those 5 categories that I've listed, Hasbro leans more on historical repaints. If you're going to get a repaint, it's going to be based on someone or a character that kind of has that name value and has that significance. And in the odd once in a while, they fall into category 2, the new character repaint, which is, hey, there's a character that we could create out of this, and maybe this character will pick up, become loved in that mold, and then we're going to have now a repaint brother indefinitely in the future. They took a risk with something like a Scourge, aka Black Convoy, and now how could you not have a Laser Rod or Laser Optimus Prime that is a black repaint afterwards? You pretty much, by creating that new character, you also guaranteed. But look, anyone who goes to Walmart or Toys R Us or Target or anything like that, there's also a lot of examples of these new characters that don't find any place. Dracodon, which is the I guess we'll call it our core class fossilizer, brand new character, not a repaint from a previously existing mold of Vertebrake, which also was a new character, but Vertebrake was the original mold. Then we got the new character repaint of Dracodon. No one wants it. So they try to test that water. It could have been many years ago. Like, what if, Cannonball from that Red Alert mold didn't sell well? Then no one would want to know from it, and that would have been that. So those are really the two categories. Once in a while we'll see the shoehorn repaint, where they'll look at I don't know, one of the helicopter molds and go, hey, we could do Rotor Storm out of this. You'll see that once in a while. The homage repaints, we really don't see them that much anymore. Again, like any homage repaints that existed back then have now become historical repaints. So like the Primal Primes, if we ever do get one, they kind of fall into that category. And the shallow repaints, like I said, they're so rare now that it's really just, you only see them in like the low budget figures and for other regions and stuff, because they know that it doesn't sell anymore, and they saw how bad they sold back in the day, and thousands and thousands of product that just rotted on the shelves for years. So that's why I think it's better today. Now when a repaint is done, it's done with a smart decision, and that's pretty much it. Where back then it was kind of hit or miss, but we were still kind of getting used to the idea of repaints, and people have also kind of accepted the fact that we can't all be completists. So another reason why people hated repaints was because they found themselves buying product that they didn't like. Imagine if you're a mini-con collector and the thousands of repaints that exist across all the different regions, especially Japan. It's something where you're buying a mold not because of its character significance or something, but because it's Sure Shock, but now it's done in purple and then orange and then blue and then green. And that falls into shallow repaint territory where there's no historical significance. There's no new character significance. It's just a shallow repaint. So I kind of hope that helps that a little bit. Again, those are the 5 categories. I'll repeat them again. Historical repaints, new character repaints, shoehorn repaints, homage repaints, and the famous shallow repaints. Hope you guys learned something. I hope you enjoyed that answer, Guido. And I hope that gave you a little bit of an idea of the repaint community. I think personally today we're in a better place because they make concentrated efforts and they really think it through and hard now when they do molds and then what they could be repainted into afterwards. It's probably the primary reason why certain characters just haven't gotten toys yet, is because they can't really figure out what they're going to want to do with that mold afterwards. They don't want to be in a situation like they used to have back in the day where it's, here's going to be Bludgeon, and then they go, man, what do we do with that? And then they just kind of shoehorn a Bonsai-tron on us. They probably want to give us a proper Bonsai-tron and a proper Bludgeon, and they just have to find the right opportunity for it. But again, that's for another time, another discussion, and another Patreon listener question. Again, if you want to be a patron and help with the Patreon, help support the podcast, be like Guido over here, and just come hang out in the Discord, or just you want to support from the sidelines and let us know we're doing a decent job. Again, patreon.com/Protoman. Check the pinned comment or the description below, and rock out with the robots in disguise.